Welcome to the Walsh Literacy Initiative's Readapalooza. In this session, we hear from Dr. Steve Dykstra.
Hi, I'm Steve Dykstra. They asked me to talk to you today as part of Readapalooza to help build enthusiasm for reading instruction, and all things related to reading and language and literacy. That's what I want to do today. I want to tell you in advance, though, that my message is going to start out a little different than a lot of what you're hearing, or what I think you're probably hearing. I believe in a love of reading and a love of books and teaching young children to read as much as anybody. But I'm going to come at it from a little different angle. One of the things I said a number of years ago that has caught on, and I don't say as much anymore, and I should really get back to it, and I'm going to try to commit to getting back to it here, is I sometimes describe reading as the great vaccine. These are good times to talk about vaccines. Reading is the great vaccine. What I mean by that is that being able to read is a vaccination against lots of bad things in your life. It solidifies you, it strengthens you, it buttresses you against the negative winds of life. In almost everything that goes on in your world, you're better off if you could read. Whatever bad thing might happen to you, whatever challenges might come your way, you're better off if you can read than if you can't. It won't solve it for you, it won't make it go away completely, but you're better off being able to read than if you can't. I'm going to tell you a story now about a girl who exemplifies that fact of reading is the great vaccine. And I want to tell you that the story starts out, it can be pretty overwhelming and a little bit sad, but I think by the end you'll see that it ends really quite positively and quite hopefully. So the little girl I'm talking about, I'm going to name Clara. I'm going to name her Clara because my great-grandmother was named Clara. One of my aunts was named Clara, and Clara was a traditional name in one side of my family. So it helps me to name this girl Clara. Clara was 8 years old when I first met her. I was working at an inpatient psychiatric unit for children, something I haven't done for a long time, and I wouldn't do now, but at the time that was still a customary way to treat young children who were in grave distress, and Clara was in grave distress. She came to our attention initially because she had done some pretty dramatic, pretty heinous, pretty dangerous things. It's hard to imagine an 8-year-old little girl doing that, but she did. And what we found out immediately was that the reason she did this was because she had had really, really terrible, awful things done to her and done with her and done around her. And these things had gone on for her whole life. She was 8 years old and she had never regularly attended school, pretty much had not been enrolled in school, was unknown to her local school system because she was kept home by her mother. For today's talk, it's enough to say she was kept home for other purposes and because she had great value. Nonetheless, Clara was a delightful young girl with a wonderful mastery of language, very bright, very energetic, very intelligent. And I would look forward every day to going up to the unit and seeing her, having conversations with her, learning about her, even the really sad things, learning about her life. I want to tell you that after this really horrific start in life, which reset itself several times, always to the dark side, always to things getting worse. Every time we thought people thought things would get better for Clara, they got worse. They nonetheless took a turn for the positive. When she left our hospital after being there for quite a while, Clara was able to go live with an older woman who took her in as a foster child, as the only foster child in the house, which was a requirement of having Clara, so she could have this woman's undivided attention. And Clara went to school for the first time and did marvelously well at school. She was so bright and she did so well. She did very, very well at school. Not that she didn't have problems, but academically and intellectually she was ready and she could thrive. And this could be a great success for her. And it was hard for Clara to live in her community because everything she saw reminded her of a terrible thing, would provoke flashbacks and memories of horrible trauma. And her foster mother, who had lived in the same community in her whole life, had grown up in the same community her whole life, had so much love for this little girl that she sold her house, her family home, and moved to an entirely different community so that Clara wouldn't be plagued on a daily basis by memories and things that she saw that brought back flashbacks for her. She made that sacrifice for her. And some years later, she went through the process at court of adopting Clara, making her her daughter, changing her name, taking her in, truly making her a part of her family. Because of all those things, Clara was able to move on with her life. And not that she doesn't still have problems. She's in her mid to late 30s today, maybe even a little older if I do the math right. It's not that she wouldn't still struggle. It's not that life isn't still a challenge. It's not that relationships and love and kindness and tenderness sometimes elude her. But I know for a fact, because I've kept up with her a little bit from a distance, she's doing surprisingly well given the way she started. So where does reading come in this whole thing? Let me tell you, when I first met Clara and knew her story, one of the most remarkable things for me was to find out that at 8, in spite of the fact that she had never attended school, she could read beautifully. And this was for 2 reasons. She was one of these kids, for all the things that life had done to her, for all the unfairness and unkindness life had heaped on her. One of the gifts life had given her was she was one of these kids with what I call a greasy, quick brain. Reading was natural for her and easy for her. She was one of those 1 or 2 or 3% of kids that takes to reading very easily. And I thought that's why she could read. But that wasn't the whole story. The other reason she could read is that Clara had a brother who was 2 years older than her. And he knew what his sister was going through every day at home. And while at 5 and 6 and 7 years old, he couldn't find it in himself. He couldn't muster the courage because he was a victim of all of this too. He couldn't find the courage to tell anybody that he had a sister at home or what she was going through. He did come home every day from school and bring extra worksheets and paper and pencils and books and anything he could find at school. He would bring it home and he would sit with her in the room where she often spent days locked in her own little private horror show. And he would, as best as he could, teach her everything he had learned at school that day. So when he was 5 and she was 3, he would teach her as much as he could. When he was 6 and she was 4, he would teach her as much as he could. And this went on until she came into the system and was saved from her nightmares. When she was 8 years old, when he was 10, he finally found the courage to go to a neighbor and say what was going on in their apartment, in their home, so that his sister and he and his younger brother were saved. He would teach her everything he possibly could. And he had taught her to read. He had brought her books and taught her to read. And learning to read alone did not save Claire. But learning to read meant that when she was saved, she could go to school and be successful. Learning to read meant that before she was saved, she could curl up with a book and disappear into it and live out a little moment of life that was different than reality. Learning to read for Clara was something that theologians call prevenient grace. It is a gift that comes to you before you know you need it, before you're ready for it, because you're going to need it sometime in the future. A love or a gift that comes to you in advance. Reading had been given to her at 3, 4, 5, 6 years old by a brother who had no other way to protect his sister. And as a result, when she was 8 and was finally delivered into a legitimate school, she was more ready than she would have been otherwise. Think of what would have happened to Clara. Think of the difference in her life if she had not been able to read. If all those other things had happened and she had not been able to read. Now think of the other children you know, or children you don't know and only imagine, whose lives are not nearly as awful as Clara's, whose lives are not nearly as dramatic as Clara's, but who nonetheless need the gift of reading before they'll need it. They need to receive the gift of reading before they'll truly need it. We need to teach them to read when they're in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade. So when they're in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade and 8th grade and 10th grade, and when they're 20 and 30 and 40, they can read. And they can receive the great vaccine in childhood so that it protects them in their life and their future later on. The prevenient grace of reading, the great vaccine of reading. That's why I'm passionate about reading. I love books as much as anybody, and I believe in a love of reading as much as anybody. But what I really love is the way that reading can be there to deliver us, to vaccinate us against the trials and tribulations of life, so that we can get through them a little bit better, so that when life is against us, at least school and academics and reading and the power of our mind and the power of our imagination will be for us. That's why I believe in reading. That's why I've agreed to come talk to you today, to Read-a-Palooza. Do all you can for all the children you can, to help them learn to read, to deliver to them the great vaccine. Thank you.